For most companies today, the workforce is a lot more than just full-time employees. It includes contractors, freelancers, gig workers, and more. Our next speakers have spent the past 4 years researching what it takes to coordinate and successfully manage that expanded workforce. Their new book, Workforce Ecosystems: Reaching Strategic Goals with People, Partners, and Technologies, is available now from MIT Press. In this session, they'll share the highlights of what they've learned so far. Welcome, Liz and David.
Fantastic to be here with co-author and guest editor and professor Liz Altman. MIT Press published our book a few weeks ago, Liz, and let's talk about why it's timely and important. But before we do that, let's give a shout out to our other co-authors, Jeff Schwartz and Robin Jones, who made tremendous contributions to this book as well. And it was finally great to meet them all together live in person in Dallas a couple weeks ago. Let's start off by providing a little bit of context about what the problem is that we were trying to solve with this research. And you have a lovely little story about how you, as a strategy professor, was brought onto this project.
Well, thank you, David. Actually, maybe I'll go back if you want the quick story on how I was brought onto this project. But I appreciate being here. It's been incredible to be involved with this team over the past few years. And so thank you to SMR and to Deloitte Consulting for working together on this work. We put together essentially a little workforce ecosystem, as we like to say. So when you first sent me an email early 2020 and said this isn't spam and I know who you are and would you like to join us as guest editor of the Future of the Workforce, I said, this is really interesting. I've looked at your work and it's mostly been focused inside of organizations, which is fabulous and it's been really great work. But I really tend to think about what happens between organizations and across organizational boundaries. I mostly study platforms and ecosystems. I'm a strategy professor. And so this may not be a great match. Maybe we shouldn't do this. It's been a pleasure speaking with you. Maybe not such a good idea. And you said, no, we know what you study. And I think very insightfully said, we think this conversation should really expand across organizational boundaries. And we agreed that if we could do an experiment and really try to think more about this with an ecosystem lens, that this might be a great idea. And at the time, I think you said, look, if it goes well, maybe we'll write a book. And then, a few weeks ago, we launched the book, which is just amazing. So when we started the project, we started having these conversations about future of the workforce. What exactly are we talking about? And we started doing these interviews. And really, even in those early interviews, I realized it made sense to start with a discussion of, if I say workforce, what do you mean? And we were talking to some very senior people, like the head of HR for Walmart, or the head of the consumer business at Amazon, or 2 Army generals, or senior people at NASA, the Mayo Clinic. It was an amazing array of people. And to a person, when I said, when you think about workforce, or when I say workforce, what do you think of? And I said it hesitantly, slightly like that, because in the beginning I thought they may think this is a really dumb question. To the contrary, they said, that is a great question. We've been thinking a lot about it. We were just in a meeting about it this morning. We should talk more about that. And they went on to say, look, it's clearly employees. If you're in the US, they're W-2, either full or part-time, but it's also contractors, freelancers, gig workers. We started hearing numbers like 30 to 50% of the contributing members of a workforce weren't employees. And you'll see that they also, this is an example from TopDial, they're very skilled, very high level people, right? So there's some lower level people, but they're also higher level people. When Amazon decided it wanted to do its contract, it wanted to have its own transportation system, it didn't hire people. It started subcontracting, often with mom and pops. But these people add value to Amazon, but don't work for Amazon. If we were in a classroom, I might say, okay, how many people have smartphones? All hands go up. How many people on those phones have only software made by the company that made either the operating system or the phone? All hands go down, right? Because phones are not that interesting. not that much fun and not that helpful unless they have apps. Those apps are developed by what we call complementary businesses, right? Or complementers. And they are not the primary business. And so our question is, are they part of the workforce? Well, they're not really vendors, and they're not employees, but they are part of the workforce. Similarly, when you look at Amazon, how many people have purchased something from Amazon that was actually purchased from someone else? And the answer will usually be a lot, right? Because Amazon is a middleman and these sellers are contributing to Amazon being able to offer what they're able to offer. And finally, we ask the question, so how many people here have recently maybe argued with a chat bot, right? You've called some sort of customer service line, you've tried to get through, you're interacting with the chatbot, or more recently, how many people have played with ChatGPT or Bard or any other generative AI and can envision how organizations can use that? And the answer is many.
Right, and NASA, sorry to interrupt, but and NASA had to give employee identification numbers to some algorithms in order to sort of get
right, because they couldn't access. The only way to get the chatbots, or the bots in that case, to access data was by to actually give them employee ID numbers. So in that case, you say, okay, given all of this, are they part of a workforce? And we said, well, if you define the workforce quite broadly, if you define it as a workforce ecosystem, then yes, right? It's composed not only of employees, but also these external contributors. And that is how we kind of set out to start thinking about workforces in a much more holistic ecosystem-based way. With that, I will turn it back to you to help us understand what we found with some of our data.
Thanks, Liz. What does that all mean when external contributors are considered to be part of an organization's workforce? I mean, it means that the boundaries and composition of the workforce are shifting. It used to be just employees and used to be internal to the firm. And with this workforce ecosystem orientation, it's not just like inside the organization, it's outside the organization as well. And it's not just employees. So that's a non-trivial shift. And it's so non-trivial that 3/4 of managers agree that effectively managing these external folks is critical to their organization's success. And that's certainly, and it's especially true for organizations like Cisco and Novartis and some of these other organizations that have tens of thousands of external contributors getting the work done. Unfortunately, and this is where the problem comes in, is that only 30% of organizations are agreeing that their organization is sufficiently preparing to manage a workforce that relies on all of these external contributors. So we found leader after leader struggling with the idea of how to think and act more deliberately and holistically and in an integrated way with both the employees and external contributors. And what we found is that those leaders who were taking this issue seriously considered it to be a holy grail or a potential strategic differentiator for them to figure this problem out. So it's not just a matter of like a semantics of who is in your workforce. It has dramatic and far-reaching implications for competitive advantage and competitiveness. Based on that, we dove in and conducted a bunch of surveys and interviewed more than 100 executives, and not just in the US, not just in the private sector, it was across public and private sectors. It was a global effort. We were talking to folks in Asia, all the different continents that there are, except for Antarctica. So many of them had, it's like 26% were over $1 billion in revenue, these organizations. So it's the research was not just us making up some opinions or talking to a few people about these issues. We did global surveys and we talked to a lot of different managers and individuals. And Liz has a bunch of connections with generals in the military. She went to West Point or taught at West Point and we wound up talking to some military folks, and they had some really interesting perspectives on, like, because they live by having an integrated approach to the military. So throughout the conduct of this research, we were publishing a lot of materials. I don't know if the number's up to 10, but between publishing articles and research reports and this recent book, the infographics, it's probably about 10 outputs related to this research. We're really excited, and we think that this is an important avenue for organizations to go along in order to really compete effectively. And by that, I mean, like, think in an integrated way and conduct themselves in an integrated way toward both the employees and their extended workforce. So what do we mean by a workforce ecosystem? Take it, Liz.
Thanks, David. So as guest editor, I'm straddling this line, always balancing between being an academic and a professor, but also wanting to come up with ideas and concepts and present them in a way that's very understandable and practical. And so together we came up with this definition of workforce ecosystem, which we think is very helpful. And we came up with a framework for orchestrating workforce ecosystems, which I will get to in a moment. So first of all, in terms of a definition, you can read it, but we've said a structure, which is a governance structure. It's a way to think about this entity, right? Focused on value creation, because in the end, it's about creating value for organizations. For an organization, consists of complementarities and interdependencies. I'll come back to that one second. And encompasses actors from within an organization and beyond. As we said, this is a lot about external contributors and their individual and collective goals. So if everybody's just working towards the goal of the main player in the ecosystem, it will not be sustainable, right? So the individual actors also have to be meeting their goals. Complementarities, what we mean is, like with apps, it's organizations working independently and individuals working independently, working together to meet goals and for mutual customers. And interdependencies, at its simplest form, means they either succeed together or fail together. They have to work together and they're dependent upon each other. So that's our general working definition. We have fun arguing about it, but we think it's pretty solid. We said, okay, so for example, this hexagon started as a circle and at one point was an octagon. However, then we made it a hexagon. Why? And it was on its side, but then we spun it. So this is our favorite hexagon because it is it's an orchestration framework. It represents how we think managers and leaders should think about pulling together all the various parts of their ecosystem. And we chose the word orchestrating versus managing, particularly because often these entities are individual, independent, and have their own agency and own goals and objectives. So I think we're probably coming towards the end of our time and we need to get to Q&A, so I'll do this very quickly. The hexagons themselves represent our key themes. So management practices need to change, technology enablers need to change, leadership approaches, and integration architectures is basically how you coordinate a workforce ecosystem. Each of those hexagons is covered in one of the chapters of the book, and we've covered them in different articles because each hexagon represents a whole series of new concepts and thinking when you take a workforce ecosystems perspective on workforces. Outside the hexagon, we've put the key leaders. Senior leaders and business unit leaders are on the kind of center axis, and essentially the framework can rotate around them. There's a top axis, human resources and procurement, because they are generally responsible for enabling or for getting all of the players together. And then IT and finance and legal are on the second axis, second horizontal axis, because they enable the technologies and the systems that make this happen. And we think there are lots of conversations we can have kind of about this framework. And so we've used it really as the basis for conversations. David, back to you.
All right. So thank you, Liz. Wonderful, quick representation of that framework. We have questions coming in. I want to get to those. We both want to get to those. But just a reminder, this is the book. Feel free to buy it. Feel compelled to buy it. and review and compliment it. So I don't know what we should. So we'll just leave this up during the Q&A. So one of the questions that came in was, what makes a workforce ecosystem healthier than another? And which gets into the question of like, how do you measure workforce ecosystem qualities? And we talk about this in the book, is that workforce ecosystems have like three main characteristics: comprehensiveness, community, and coordination. And the three, we call it the 3 C's. And you can have you can be really strong on the community one can be, you build a community around and for and with the external contributors, and you blend them together with the internal folks. And there are others that we've seen in organizations that are less community oriented. Doesn't mean that they're worse. In fact, one of the organizations, Planomatic, we just talked about in the book, they tried to build a stronger community around and with their external contributors, but it wasn't something that really got traction. And so it just turns out that sometimes external contributors prefer a more of a transactional relationship with the firm, and it's a real, there are a whole bunch of trade-offs that happen around the extent to which you try to impose a transactional or community-oriented way, and how much you try to elicit or adapt to what's there and what. Anyway, so that's just one dimension.
Yes. So, well, and in that case, I would say they probably do have a very strong community because they need the community to operate. They've played with how to get the culture right between their internal and external. Yeah, I think you've said it well. I would go back to meeting strategic goals, which we put in the title of the book, right? So if a workforce ecosystem is enabling organization to hit their goals and also the goals of the contributors, then it's doing its job, right? And yes, we can do all kinds of metrics along the way, but I think we should stick to remembering that this is fundamentally about value creation and about outcomes. I see we have a few. Am I allowed to pick questions, or are we? Because I can see
you have permission. We've got 3 minutes 45 seconds. Go for it.
Oh, I see 5 minutes 37 seconds. Okay. In any case, one quick question just to clarify. Someone says, "What do you mean by procurement?" And we mean the organization within a company or a business, usually part of supply chain, but often they're the ones who are doing the contracts with contractors or with large companies supplying contractors. And so that's important because, for example, if they have a contract and it's bringing in 10,000 software developers, then the procurement organization is kind of managing that relationship or a big part of enabling that relationship. And that's why we pull procurement into the conversation. And the other quick question was, for social media, how would users like on Facebook and Instagram fall into this category? And I think this is a really interesting question because we get into this question of content creators, customers, contributors, complementers, and each one we can have a conversation about. And I guess I would say that, again, we're trying to take as broad a perspective as possible. So particularly if you think about YouTube or TikTok, but YouTube definitely, those content creators are contributing to the business in a very meaningful way and enabling the business to go forward. So for many platform businesses that rely on contributions from users, those users absolutely, in my mind, are part of the workforce ecosystem. And so that's actually very interesting because the relationship between the company and their customers or contributors is a little more complex than it was when a company was just selling a product to customers.
Yeah, and when you move beyond the content creators and the relationship between platforms and content creators, there are other platforms where there are a host of where the users have there are a bunch of legal and ethical issues that come into play. And one of the things we talk about in the book is Meta's use of contractors and content moderation, and then with Uber, there's a whole bunch of legal issues going on, not only in this country but in countries around the world. Like, should these users be considered employees or not? Should they have access to benefits or not? And these are really important questions.
Well, and the third part of the book, and I give credit to you here, David, because this was the part that you drove more than others, but the third part of the book is about ethics and social responsibilities and corporate social responsibility. And so I think, that's not where this question started, but I think it makes sense for us to mention that we're very aware that this structure leads to all kinds of questions. And someone in the chat mentioned something about who owns intellectual property, for example. And that is there's an ongoing discussion. There are different mechanisms for working with it. It's not that it hasn't been addressed at all, but I think these discussions continue to evolve as workforce ecosystems become more prevalent.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Just one other thing on that is, like, as someone with a background in ethics, one of the really interesting and I think important aspects of what we're doing in this book and with this shift to workforce ecosystems is there are some really significant implications for social responsibility and overall purpose for an organization. And you can have workforce ecosystems that aren't as ethical as others, or aren't as they don't promote as much social good as others. And there are a lot of choices for leaders to make around the kind of workforce ecosystem that they want. And we try to set up some of the key questions for leaders to ask in the book. And if I sound like I'm repeating the book too often,
as I keep saying, I never wanted to be that author who always said, "Oh, it's in the book," but I have become that author. One quick point here, because it's again, as a strategy professor, somebody said, when it comes to Cheryl Estrada said, when it comes to strategy and value creation within a workforce ecosystem, does that ultimately fall under the purview of the CEO and CFO? And I would say, one of the things that's been great about this conversation is that we have realized that these discussions move to the C-suite, right? They are strategic conversations because they get to the heart of how organizations compete, how they compete against their competitors in an industry, how they develop new products and services, how they move into new markets. So yes, ultimately, we think this is a very cross-functional C-level discussion, but we also see it going down deep into an organization, right? Someone can be managing a very small department, and part of that department will be internal players, and part of it will be maybe a contractor, and part of it might be relationships with external companies, and then also using technologies. So on one hand, it's at the C-suite. On the other hand, we have seen my students and lower level and mid-level managers very interested in these concepts because they're needing to operate in these complex, networked, interconnected ecosystem types of environments.
So this is as you folks can tell, we
love this stuff.
We love this stuff. We're excited to talk about it, but our time is at an end, and I'm going to give it over to Allie. And thank you, Liz. This was great, and really excited to see how the book plays with the audience.
Great. Thanks very much.